Now, it hasn't just been 40 years of poor economic decision making, which has brought us to the point of the collapse of the states and municipalities across our nation, brought us to the point of not being able to produce enough food around the world, and leading to the uprisings, the mass strike here in our nation and abroad. But this has been a result of an intentional policy by the British Empire to undermine the sovereignty of our nation. This is what led to the takedown, the repeal of Glass-Steagall. This is what led to the destruction of the fixed standard of exchange in 1971, which created the environment in which the inter-alfa group could operate. Essentially, what had happened is not only was the British Empire able to destroy the sovereignty of the United States, but also created the conditions by which we were induced to do that ourselves. So here's the first half of that interview, and make sure to tune into this website on Thursday at 1 p.m. for Mr. LaRouche's international webcast. Hi, this is Dennis Mason. Joining me in the studio today is John Holful, and we want to continue the discussion that we've been posting on this site around some of the aspects of the economic breakdown which haven't necessarily been covered by the FCIC report in the text. They did what they were assigned to do in terms of creating a government report that could be relied on to see what brought us to this point right now where we have the mass strike. It's clear to everybody around not just the United States but the world that this economic system is not functioning. It doesn't take care of the people and is disintegrating out from underneath us. So today we wanted to cover the founding of, well, not necessarily founding of, but the actions of what has become known as the inter-alfa group of banks, which was established in 1971, shortly after the abolishment of the fixed exchange rate. And the bubbles which resulted from this grouping, this arm of the British Empire, which have served to destroy the United States. You didn't just have random bubbles as cycles of an economic system, but that this grouping, this arm of the British monetarist empire, seeks to destroy the sovereignty of the nation state using finances as a means of warfare. So that's...
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, if you take it from the end of World War II. Actually, I mean, the fight against the British Empire, the United States, goes back to our founding and before we actually formed our nation. So this has been going on for a long time. And then after the Civil War, excuse me, we had this outbreak of the American system in which we were spreading progress all around the world. And in particular, we were spreading railroads into the interiors of the continents of the United States, Europe.
Yeah, Germany picked up on this, Russia picked up on this, and that threatened the control by the British Empire, the monetarist empire, of the sea lanes, which is their chokehold on the ability of sovereign nations to be able to trade amongst one another.
Yeah, it was a direct threat to the maritime empire because the British Empire, which is a continuation basically of the Roman Empire through Venice, is a maritime empire. The control of the seas, the control of sea routes and trading and ports, and the financing of trade and that sort of thing. This is what the empire has historically used as its power base. So when you start opening up the interiors via railroad, which are actually more efficient in moving goods than sea power in many respects, you're changing the political map of the world. So the British went nuts. So you had a whole series of things: the overthrow of Bismarck, the Russian Revolution, World War I, the fascist movements in between World War I and World War II, where they tried to destroy nation states and create a global fascist empire. And then you had World War II. Now, the problem with World War II is that the British created Hitler, but Hitler turned on them. So they needed the United States, which they were trying desperately to destroy, to bail them out. And we did. We saved them. But we had FDR, and FDR told Winston Churchill, the British Empire is finished after the war. We didn't fight this war to save the British Empire, which sent Churchill into apoplexy. All right, so that was the scene coming out of World War II. Then as soon as FDR died, the Brits started going after the United States to try to take it down. The plan was, we were the world's leading industrial power. We were stronger than all of Europe. So that had to be changed. So that means two things. That means, one, you start taking down the U.S. industrial power, and two, you start building up Europe. And the idea was to build up Europe as a financial power. So you had a number of events, the Treaty of Rome, the beginning of the creation of the European community, which was a way to build up Europe as a base from which to attack the United States.
Is this a precursor, kind of that's setting the foundation for what we know today as the Eurozone, that type of of supranational sort of control governance over the nations?
A European-wide fascist government. Yeah. And so it was in this, as part of this move, then the inter-alfa group was created in 1971. Now, the inter-alfa group was created by a group of relatively small European banks, which represented the fondi, the private funds of the oligarchs of the empire. You know, the fondi, because it's an Italian term meaning funds, but it comes from Venice. These are the Venetians at work.
The old family banking.
Yeah. Of which things like the Rothschilds are a representative. Rothschilds, Warburgs, Lazard here in the United States, in France, in Britain. These are representatives of this. But the inter-alfa group was basically, the nucleus of it was these old family funds which were used to create, they were going to unify Europe from the standpoint of creating, so you could create giant banks in Europe than to take on the United States. So they began consolidating in Europe using these old family funds. But they understood that in order to build a financial empire of the size that they needed, their own money, as much as it was not enough. So they had to bring in other people's money. They had to find a way to leverage money belonging to others. So the inter-alfa group's assignment was to do just that, to start creating markets, to create what we know today as globalization. Right. So you had the group founded in 1971. In 1973, you had the Egyptian-Israeli war, which led to the oil boycott against the United States, which created the spot market. This was the basis for the creation of the spot market in oil, which then shot oil prices up and started creating this pool of Eurodollars that could then be used by the inter-alfa group for their own purposes and for speculation against the United States. And this was with the oil hoax of 1979, the Iranian crisis. Then this took another giant step forward, so that you see that this oil speculation, which we have today, now with oil, $100 a barrel.
Right.
This is a continuation of that same process. This is a giant pool of money which is being looted from nations around the world in order to fund this inter-alfa operation.
As well as other things like the whole BAE and Al Yamama scandal, I guess is one way to put it, in terms of funding different aspects of terrorism, funding things like the capability to pull off 9/11, funding the capability to have different military groups to then cause chaos in different regions in order to maintain the ability to have governance over different regions. Also, it seems to be part of that.
Yeah, and another major element of this is dope.
Yeah.
The global dope trade, which the British Empire controls, which British banks and the inter-alfa banks control. And you see this, this goes back to the days of the opium wars against China, in which the British would force Indian opium on China at the point of a gun. And that's never really changed. You can see that today in the way in which the British are protecting the opium trade in Afghanistan with the help of President Obama. So, and if you shut down the drug trade, it would basically collapse the global banking system, because they need that money very much. And if you look at the spread, there's no accident that the spread of European banks largely into Mexico is what made it possible for the drug trade to start taking that nation over. It wouldn't be possible without the banking networks. That where the drug trade flourishes, the banking network is always set up first, because otherwise the drug trade would choke on its own cash. So the bankers are an integral part of the drug trade. And the people who, if you follow the money instead of the dope, money always goes back to the boardrooms, in the city of London and in Wall Street and places like that. So the dope trade, the funding of terrorism and other operations, we've seen this in the case of one of the founding members of the inter-alfa group, Bacco Ambrosiano of Italy, was very much tied to the P2 Freemasonic Lodge, which was involved in running terrorism in Italy, which was had a bunch of old Nazis and Mussolini black shirt people, that they were deploying for various purposes, and they were running drugs and running guns. And, this is just pure crime, organized crime. And that gives you some insight into what this inter-alfa group is. But as it spread, it was spreading in Europe as Europe was consolidating, the European Economic Community, the European Union, finally the Euro. In the United States, you had a similar process of consolidation of the financial side of things. You had in 1968, you had the Bilderberger meeting in Canada, where this idea of the world company was put forward, that you'd have the cartels, corporate cartels, replacing nation states as the rulers of the world. That the bankers would run the cartels and the cartels would run the world. And this was explicitly against the nation state. It was explicitly Malthusian, that you can't trust nations to manage resources because they tend to think that the resources in their borders belong to them. And they don't. They belong to the empire.
Well, it seems that at that point in time, 68, this is before the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system.
Yeah.
As much as Glass-Steagall in the United States, which took till 1999 to officially take down, at that point in time, because that type of mentality where you have international corporations, what have you, determining global finance, you can't do that with a fixed exchange rate system. You can't. It seems like you can't wage monetary warfare in the same way until you uncouple the currencies from anything having to do with physical reality.
Yeah, you can't. And the idea was to turn, since the empire has always been a monetary empire, they want to shed all controls on money. They want to be able to do whatever they want with money. And when you have a fixed exchange rate, which Roosevelt put into place explicitly to stop them from being able to do that, that's a real obstacle to them. Now, it was the ending of the exchange rate, the fixed exchange rate, which made the modern derivatives market possible. Because the derivatives market largely started out as currency speculation. This is what George Soros got so rich doing, currency speculation, supposedly in 1992, the man who broke the pound. But using these giant pools of money as a battering ram against nations. Now, he supposedly attacked the British pound and, broke the Bank of England, they say. But, as I've said before, the proof that he didn't break the Bank of England is that he's still alive.
Yeah. And also as part of the move to take down the fixed exchange rate system in the first place, they actually had to sink the pound in order to create the conditions. The British Empire aren't concerned about defending their people if it's in their geopolitical interests to get something done to be able to expand their monetary empire. They'll easily sacrifice their people or their own currency.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question then is, what do you mean by their people? Because to the British Empire, their people are the oligarchs, not the people of England or the people of what you would think of as the nation of Great Britain or the currency of that nation. That those are expendable. That this is a parasite which moved from Rome to Byzantium to Venice and to Holland and then to England. And it moves around. It's not loyal to any particular place. And it will move again if necessary. So it's perfectly willing to throw the nation of Great Britain under the bus. If it's convenient for them. So yeah, they'll sink the pound. They don't care what it does to the people of England, because they don't care about the people of England. And so you have this currency warfare. And if you look at what happened in Ibero-America as an example of how this works, you had nation after nation which are trying to emulate the United States, borrowed money for infrastructure projects to make their economies more efficient, to try to become industrial powers in their own right, to build up their nation to make it self-sufficient. And the bankers came in and lent them money. And then but they lent them money in dollars. And then after they were on the hook for all these loans, then the bankers came in, and because there was no fixed exchange rates, they were able to run currency warfare against them and force them to devalue their currency against the dollar. So they were devaluing their own currency, yet they still had to pay their debts in dollars. So it took more and more pesos, for example, to pay off a dollar's worth of debt than ever before. So the amount that they were having to pay for their debt service was going up and up and up to the point where they couldn't meet their debt service. So then the IMF would come in and say, well, okay, you're a deadbeat. You've got to stop all these projects, these expensive infrastructure projects. We can't afford them. You've got to concentrate on paying us. The result was, after several cycles of this, that these nations had paid back more than they ever originally borrowed. Their infrastructure projects were dead, and they were further in debt than ever before, and had the IMF and the international banks more and more involved in running their countries. They lost control of their countries to this process. And this is possible because the fixed exchange rate was taken down. And then you had the rise of another part of the derivatives market, which is the biggest part now, which is interest rate derivatives, which are basically bets on bonds, bets on debt. And this is the real heart of the Venetian debt farming, that you get everybody hooked on debt and then you can control them by their debt. You look at the way today in which, say, this idiot Bill Gross of PIMCO or PIMPCO, the world's largest bond fund, is always telling the United States government what they should do. Well, who the hell is he? He's a representative of the oligarchy. He's not an oligarch, but he's their mouthpiece. We don't care what he thinks.
Well, that's exactly what one aspect of what's happening right now around the states is that you have the states which are indebted, they can't generate their own credit to get out of the debt themselves. And so being technically in debt on paper for as a result of being swindled over the last decades into rolling over these kinds of debt streams in order to seem more prosperous and have the money flow to get to the teachers, the firefighters, and this kind of thing. Now that that has completely collapsed, you have these same sorts of folks coming into the states saying, well, you got to pay up, you got to pay up, you got to pay up. What does that mean? That means cutting police, cutting fire, cutting state services, cutting Medicare, Medicaid rather. And the people aren't tolerating that. They're not going for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, who are the people who are demanding this austerity? Let's take one example. Let's take the case of Peter G. Peterson.
Pete Peterson.
Pete Peterson, yes. A real stuffed shirt. Okay. Now, Pete Peterson comes out of the University of Chicago, which is as fascist as it gets. The Chicago School is fascist economics.
That was what was the basis for what happened in Chile with Pinochet, right? The Chicago Boys, this whole method.
Milton Friedman in his defense of the drug trade. Mm-hmm. Complete free enterprise. We can do whatever we want, and you don't have anything to say about it. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, he was picked up by Lazard and put in as the head of a company called Bell and Howell, which, no big deal. But back then, this was when movie projectors were the big thing. So it was sort of a media company in a sense, right? Uh-huh. All right. Then he was picked up by George Shultz to work in the Nixon administration to head the team writing the justification for taking the dollar off of gold. All right. When Pete Peterson was in Washington, his blind trust was administered by Felix Rohatyn of Lazard. All right. So this is a Felix Rohatyn boy. And since Felix Rohatyn is a fascist, it should be no surprise that Pete Peterson is a fascist. All right, so Peterson was there. I mean, he didn't do it. He was just one of the figureheads there to do it. I mean, he was never so important that he actually was the guy who did something. Mm-hmm. He was just a flunky as part of the process. All right, then after he got through in Washington, he went to Lehman Brothers, where he was brought in by George Ball, Mr. World Company. All right. Then he was at Lehman Brothers for a while. He was finally pushed out as the goal of the inter-alfa group to create these markets and to create the traders, people who were involved in securities trading as the big power on Wall Street, which is what they did. Then he was then eased out of Lehman Brothers and went off to found Blackstone Group. All right. But he has always been a creature of the inter-alfa group, basically. And, when Blackstone went public, one of the people on its board was Lord Jacob Rothschild, the guy who runs the inter-alfa group. Mm-hmm. So this tells you what the Blackstone group is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Pete Peterson, the guy who's now this billionaire who's telling us and funding all of these operations, the IOUSA, all of these operations to tell us we're spending too much money. He's just a parasite. Mm-hmm. And he got rich by being a whore for the inter-alfa group. So instead of listening to him, we ought to throw him in jail. Yeah, you should take what he says as a confession and act accordingly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. These guys, if you investigate them at all, you start running into crime after crime. So it's never any problem to find the things you can throw them in jail for. Mm-hmm. You just have to have the political will to go after them. Mm-hmm. But that's an example of how this works. And so, the billionaires who are telling us we're spending too much. We have the bailout. We have unlimited. The federal government has written a blank check for the bailout. It's warping the whole economy. The central banks are warping the whole world in order to continue to fund the bailout of their system. Because without taxpayer money, that system would have collapsed, 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. So the only thing keeping it alive is taxpayer money, and they're sucking money out of nation states at an astonishing rate. And then they turn around and they tell the nation states, you guys are you're not fiscally responsible.
Right.
You're spending too much money. So, what do we have here? Cut your Social Security. We can't afford it. We need that money for our bailout. Mm-hmm. You're spending too much money on education. We can't afford health care. We can't afford police departments. We can't afford fire departments. We can't afford to pick up your trash. You people need to take your own trash to the dump. You want water? Dig a well. We can't afford you. It's our money. We need it. Mm-hmm. That's really what they're saying. And this comes straight from the top, from this tiny percentage of the American population, which is super rich, which is part of this British imperial system, and which is determined to protect it. Mm-hmm. Because they're not independent of Britain. This is the British Empire at work. And elements of this empire, it's an empire which is worldwide, that there are elements of it which are located in the United States, that this Venetian parasite is all over the place. And they're the ones telling us that we have to cut back. Mm-hmm. They want to take us back to third world living standards, just like they've suppressed the nations of Ibero-America, and just look at what they've done to Africa. Yep. And that's what they're trying to do to us. And this is deliberate. Mm-hmm. This is genocide. They've said, Prince Philip has said, 2 billion people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. This is what the inter-alfa group is designed to do. You have a plan which you destroy the industrial base of the United States. So you're not producing anything anymore. You're not creating wealth anymore. Right? In order to make up for that, you start creating all these financial games where the people who are rich can get richer and richer. Mm. And the people who are not rich, well, they just sort of drop off the edge, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, look at the tax codes. The tax codes are all designed so that if you have money, it's easy to make more money. That the taxes are paid by people who work for a living and not by people who live off their investment incomes. Mm-hmm. The whole thing is structured to be unequal. And so then this thing, the bubble, the casino gets bigger and bigger while the economy underneath it collapses further and further.
Well, as part of that, as part of the building up of the bubble, because you did used to have the case in this nation where if you were, the now fabled middle class, and you were looking toward sending your children to college or buying a home in which to live, these kinds of things, that there were ways in which you could safely invest in order to have these kinds of things. For example, into the water and power and general public utilities were low-risk investments, bonds, these kinds of things. That at the time where, like, for example, the idea behind a 30-year bond, right, is that at the end of that, you would have a nice, safe investment such that you could rely on that to then determine your future, determine how you're going to live later on. Where when you had these things taken down, for example, one thing I remember when I was younger was the savings and loan crisis, which was a big deal. And these kinds of and then what you had with the Enron method of economy, if you want to call it that, swindle, crime, which has become regular economy today, everything that was stable within our economy has been taken away, such that anybody who is looking toward the future has no choice but to, if you're thinking, okay, you're in your 20s or 30s, some 5-10 years ago, and you're thinking, well, okay, where do I want to be 20 years from now? So what other opportunity do you have other than joining in this casino economy, where it seems that the situation was created that the only option for people to try and act on a future that they had in their imagination was to get involved with this casino economy. That became the general norm for for society.
Yeah, which, I mean, this is what the inter-alfa group created. Right?
Yeah.
That the idea is that you take away stability and then you sell insurance, the derivatives market.
To insure against the risk.
To insure against the risk. Now, it's a variation of the old mafia extortion racket. Where you go to a business in the middle of the night, you throw a brick through their window, and then you send your goon in the next day and say, if you'll come up with a little bit every week, we'll protect your windows. This won't happen again. So you kill world trade when you do this, except for ordinary people and ordinary companies. Because let's say you want to build a plant to produce something for exports. Right? But if the currency is stable, then you can say, okay, if I sell this product, I can make a product here. I can sell it in Mexico. And I can get enough pesos in Mexico to make it worth my dollar costs here. Mm-hmm. Or I can build a plant in Mexico. I know it's going to cost me so many pesos to build that plant, but I know what that's going to cost me in dollars because the exchange rates are stable. Mm-hmm. Because in the best of all worlds, they're fixed.
Yeah.
All right. Now you take away that stability. Okay, suddenly you have no idea, no guarantee, no confidence that those exchange rates are going to stay the same for the duration of your project. So you may build a plant there and then turn out that you can't possibly sell your product at a high enough price to cover the cost. Mm-hmm. Or you can't pay for it. You can't pay to build your plant because the currency rates change too much. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's not a problem because Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan or any one of a number of others will sell you derivatives. And they'll say if the currency rates move against you, well, you could buy insurance on that. So yeah, we'll manipulate the currencies to make them unstable, and then we'll sell you the insurance to protect yourself. Now, if they weren't manipulating the currencies, there would be no need for the insurance. Yeah. So this is the mafia racket. Mm-hmm. This is the essence of the modern derivatives market. Mm-hmm. And then you get into offshoots like the S&Ls you mentioned. The S&Ls were taken down because they worked, because they provided stable funding for mortgages. So that system was systematically destroyed. The big banks gobbled up the best parts of it. Other parts of it were left to collapse. And that paved the way for the modern mortgage-backed securities market. Now, the mortgage-backed securities market, like the derivatives market in general, is a marvel of modern finance because you're essentially creating something out of nothing. It's the biggest scam you can imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, people thought Milken's junk bonds were a scam,
mm-hmm.
and they were.
Mm-hmm.
And Milken went to jail.
Yeah.
But what the derivatives market has done makes Milken, look like a beginner. Because this is the process, right? You start off small,
yeah,
and then you just keep getting wilder and wilder and wilder.
Yeah, with today's authorities, Milken would actually probably win an economic prize for.
Well, yeah, he was
instead
lauded.
Of being thrown in jail.
He was lauded for his work, and even though he was thrown in jail, he was allowed to keep $500 million. So he got his reward. But since Drexel, Burnham, Lambert, and Milken were part of our friends, the inter-alfa group, right? Because there's an official side, these individual banks, and then there's this hidden side of it, which is largely operating, around the world, but a lot of it inside the United States. Things that you don't necessarily associate with the inter-alfa group, like Drexel Burnham, like Lazard, like Blackstone, like J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, these things. They're all the familiar names. They're part of this global apparatus. And so they come in and they set up this system where they make everything chaotic, and then they sell the insurance. All right. Then you have this creation. You need more money for the machine. So what do? You said, okay, well, let's run up real estate prices. Let's use all the quote unquote value that we create by running up real estate prices and use that as the basis for derivative speculation. All right. So you create value, quote unquote, out of thin air by running up real estate prices artificially. All right. By the mortgage-backed security. So you take all these mortgages and you pool them together. Then you issue a derivative, a mortgage-backed security, based upon that pool of mortgages. Except that it's not really based on that pool of mortgages. That's a polite little fiction to make it sound good. Right.
Make it seem legitimate.
Yeah. And then you take the mortgage-backed security and you create other derivatives off of that. Then you create other derivatives off of those. You know, and then you create credit default swaps to protect you in case these derivatives go bad. Now, the credit default swaps are not ever intended really to pay off if the derivatives go bad, because you're building a pyramid scheme. The purpose of the credit default swap is to allow the rating agencies to give the securities you're creating a AAA rating so that you can sell them to suckers.
Again, make them seem legitimate.
Yeah, like your pension funds and things like that. So this whole thing is just an elaborate scam.
Yeah.
All right. Now, when the markets collapsed in the summer of 2007, what collapsed was this mortgage-backed securities related derivatives machine. That's where the system blew up. But it wasn't a subprime crisis. The subprime crisis was the loosening of terms in order to keep the money flowing to feed the derivatives machine. All right, so it blows up. Suddenly, all of the insiders quit playing the game. They want out. They don't want to buy more of these securities. They want out. All right. This leads to the crisis in March of 2008, where Bear Stearns went under and was picked up with a nice little bailout by J.P. Morgan Chase. All right. Now, when the markets collapsed in the summer of 2007, what collapsed was this mortgage-backed securities related derivatives machine. That's where the system blew up. But it wasn't a subprime crisis. The subprime crisis was the loosening of terms in order to keep the money flowing to feed the derivatives machine. All right, so it blows up. Suddenly, all of the insiders quit playing the game. They want out. They don't want to buy more of these securities. They want out. All right. This leads to the crisis in March of 2008, where Bear Stearns went under and was picked up with a nice little bailout by J.P. Morgan Chase. And then the big collapse, which occurred in September 2008, when the whole system ground to a halt. The whole system was going under, just like Lyndon LaRouche said it was going to.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens?
You're talking about when all the interbank lending stopped and just the whole...
I mean, you had these investment banks which fund themselves by borrowing billions of dollars every day.
Every day.
You know, so they borrow through the money market. They borrow from things like General Electric, but they have this enormous funding that they have to do every night. They have a whole department, each one of them, a whole department designed to raise money every night so that they can open their doors the next day. And all of a sudden, that started drying up. So they were about to start falling. And this is when we had the famous weekend where Lehman Brothers went under. Merrill Lynch was taken over by Bank of America. All right. Well, I suspect, I can't prove it, but I think that Lehman Brothers was actually pushed over the edge by the inter-alfa group system. Because the whole system was going down. The only way to save it was a government bailout. And the only way to get a government bailout was to create a giant crisis. Something had to be sacrificed. And that something was Lehman Brothers. Now, it was bankrupt, without a doubt. It should have been shut down, without a doubt. But so were they all. So, they, in the manner of a pack of wolves turning on one of their own, they created the conditions for the bailout. And then in short order, within a period of days, all right, Lehman was shut down. Merrill Lynch, which was the next one to go, was taken over by Bank of America. Morgan Stanley got a big injection of money from the Japanese. Goldman Sachs got a big injection of money from Warren Buffett. Wall Street was bailed out. And the government bailout was set up, not just the TARP, but all sorts of other facilities, which kept being expanded throughout this whole period. So you got to the point where the government was the market. That all of these banks are open now because the government is subsidizing them. The stock market is at a high level because it's being effectively subsidized by the government. The mortgage market exists only because it's being subsidized by the government. There is no free market. The government is funding everything, and the government is bankrupt.
Right.
And then Peterson comes in and says, the federal government is bankrupt. It's being a spendthrift. Well, to the extent that we're bailing you out, yeah. But this is all the result of this process of the creation of these financial markets by the inter-alfa group, the creation of globalization. So you have this giant setup where this big bubble is created. The most important thing is that the real economy was killed.
Yeah.
All right. We didn't
by
go
design,
by design.
Intention. It wasn't.
We didn't go nuclear. We didn't shift our economy upwards to a higher energy flux density. We instead allowed our infrastructure to deteriorate. We shut down our manufacturing. We moved a lot of it overseas in search of the cheapest labor costs, this race to the bottom. And then we made up for it by building the giant casino. All right. And in a sense, the giant casino was the hook. You get everybody thinking, okay, now we're going to get rich. We're all going to get rich. We're going to get richer than ever before. And then it blows up. And then what happens? Then the same system comes in and says, okay, save us, bail us out. All right? That's what destroys, that's the final nail in the coffin of the nation state. When you start bailing out this pile of fictitious capital, you're letting your real economy collapse in order to bail out all this monopoly money. I mean, it's sort of like, you have these giant multiplayer online games, like World of Warcraft and things like that, right? Where people they forget their lives and they start playing all these games. Well, if you think about Wall Street as that sort of thing, only the game is sort of a variation on Monopoly.
Yeah, right.
And all of these traders are sitting around trading with each other and playing this game, and they all go further and further into this Monopoly game. And the real economy continues to shut down because nobody's going to work anymore. They're all off at home playing Monopoly. That's in a sense what happened to this country. And now the Monopoly game blows up, and they say, all right, the government's got to bail us out.
Oh.
Well, no, we don't. What we need to do is return to Glass-Steagall.
Right.
Because what you have to do is you have to stop this game. You have to stop this whole inter-alfa process. You have to go back to an American system economy. You have to go back to the kinds of regulations that FDR put into place. That, you know, they say that this is a modern economy and we can't go back to 1930s regulations. You know, I laugh every time I hear this because modern regulation was what FDR did.
Yeah.
And what all of this deregulation is a return to what existed before that. Mm-hmm. To basically a return to the glory days of the empire when they could do whatever they wanted and no nation could stop them.
Yeah.
And the United States was formed in part to stop them. And we were doing a very good job of it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's time we pick that up again.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you look at some of these figures of trillions and trillions and quadrillions, really, of dollars worth of nominal debt, and then compare that to the magnitude of credit which, if we were to issue on the federal level to the states, to stabilize the states, that if you look at the difference between those two magnitudes, you can quite quickly see how insane and really silly this whole inter-alfa bubble actually is, and why it's not just it shouldn't really be a big deal to write off all of this funny money because it's obviously completely fantasy, and not only that, but it's destroying the attempt to pay it back. You couldn't do. You could not pay back. We could never. The citizens of the United States, we could not fulfill the bailout in terms of paying it back. Our country would disintegrate long before then. That's what's happening right now. So it seems to me we're at a point of choice right now, which is, I think, one aspect to why people are rising up around the nation now, around the world, around the nation. Is the recognition of that fact that if we keep going down this road with a bailout, with President Obama's policies, with some of these wacko Gaddafi duck types like Governor, what we call him last week, Death Walker of Wisconsin, that if we keep going down this road, it's recognized that we're going to that there is no future, that there's no future for the children, there's no future for the adults of this generation, that we're going to collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a debt crisis now. We have a debt that we cannot pay. Before we started the bailout, we had a debt that we couldn't pay. Mm-hmm. That was part of what was killing us. And the bailout process is increasing the level of debt in the economy. So you get this idiot Bernanke who talks about how all of his policies are working. And all he's doing, well, there are more crimes than that. I don't want to let him off the hook in any way. But one of the things he's doing is he's creating more and more debt on an economy whose ability to service that debt is collapsing. Mm-hmm. It's insane. It's criminally insane.
It's lethal to the nation.
It's lethal to the nation. I mean, you can't look at the cost of the bailout in money terms alone, because what it is doing is killing the nation and killing civilization. And, you know, that's the problem. This is not a job for accountants. You can't look at it in accounting terms. How much is this going to cost versus how much is that going to cost? You have to look at what's being done to the nation and what's being done to its people and say, this is intolerable, this is not acceptable, and we will not let this continue. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you see with, you know, the outbreak of demonstrations all across the world. That the British Empire is committed to genocide. It's committed to lowering the population of the world by 2/3. And you do that by squeezing people, by having speculation in the price of food. There's not enough food around, and the food there is becoming too expensive.
Too much demand, as they put it.
Yeah,
too many people demand. Who are hungry.
Right.
Oh.
And this is an old game. But this is Venice at work. Mm-hmm. And this is what we have to stop. I mean, this is, you look at Enron. You mentioned Enron before. The Enron model of turning electricity into a free market profit center. Mm-hmm. Whereas before you had these utilities, electric utilities, which produced electricity. They had a monopoly in their own market. Now, here's an area, you produce the electricity for this area. You're going to be regulated. Mm-hmm. You can charge enough to get to turn a profit so that you're a sound business, but you can't gouge the population. We won't let you. You accept this regulation in exchange for the monopoly. Mm-hmm. And you will operate accordingly. Now, that model worked. It worked very well.
That's the sort of thing that the states would previously invest in rather than this mm-hmm. casino. Oh.
Yeah. And so then comes the idea of deregulation with Enron as the leading purveyor. Mm-hmm. Enron, of course, learned deregulation in Britain mm-hmm. under Margaret Thatcher and was steered by Lazarus Rothschild. And they set up a financial middleman between the producers and the consumers with the idea that the financial middleman was to make as much money as possible. Mm-hmm. All right. So you turn electricity into something that's a speculative vehicle. And it's actually modeled on what they did with oil. All right. Now, what does that do to an economy when your electricity costs start going sky high? It destroys your economy. Whereas electricity ought to be cheap and prices stable. You want to encourage people to use it because electricity increases the productive power of human labor. Mm-hmm. So therefore you want to have a lot of it and you want to have it cheap. That's what the economy needs. And when you get heat waves, you want people to be able to turn on their air conditioners so they can stay cool. Mm-hmm. And get some sleep and go to work the next day and do something productive. Yeah. Instead you get these, what we have now is, in giant heat waves, they say, everybody should turn off their air conditioner
to conserve. Yeah.
Well, that's a confession. Uh-huh. But this idea of turning everything into a profit center, like they want to do with, toll roads or parking meters in Chicago. That sort of thing. Privatize government assets and then charge people whatever the market will bear for using those elements of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. This is economically insane. Mm-hmm. And it's criminal because you're taking things that were paid for with public money that are in the public trust and you're selling them off to private interest and letting them price gouge. You're betraying the nation when you do that.
I think this is one of the more important aspects of us getting a Glass-Steagall standard through, because it's not, as has been covered on this site, there are many aspects to the Glass-Steagall legislation. I think in this context of what you're bringing up, part of that is not just the separation of the banks and the finances, but the creating of the approach toward credit and toward finances that doesn't even allow that to be that type of method of economy, if you will. This whole privatizing all basically selling off the general welfare. It creates the conditions to where that's not an option. You don't have the states trying to make ends meet and looking for any kind of quick money or any money at all and say, well, maybe we'll sell off part of our state house or this kind of thing. You won't have that kind of environment in which for the type of operations coming from things like the inter-alfa group to actually function.
Mm-hmm. And you look at other aspects of this, like you have this phenomena of allowing corporations to patent life forms. Yeah. which you see with the
Monsanto.
Monsanto is the best example of this. You know, there are all these other life sciences companies that are creating life forms and trying to patent them. But Monsanto and what it does with its seeds. Now, this is a fascist operation. Monsanto is closely tied to the British royal family, which should be no surprise given the way it operates. And so they develop seeds, the genetically modified seeds that they patent. These life forms belong to us. You know, as if they have any right to patent life, that they developed life, you know.
Yeah.
And then, in addition to selling these seeds, they have this very aggressive policing operation, which is if a farmer here buys our seed and uses it, and in the process of planting and harvesting, some of those seeds blow over into the neighbor's field, if we can detect any of our genetic material in the neighbor's field, then the neighbor's guilty of a crime. You know, and they've had Blackwater go in and do intelligence on opposition groups, farmers who get together to protest this stuff. So, you know, I mean, this is just a pure fascist operation, and it really needs to be broken up. The idea that you can patent life has to be ended. You know, otherwise, you know, what are you going to have? You're going to have the royal family try to get the patent on air. You know, you have to pay us if you want to breathe.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is all crazy, but this shows you how far this whole process has gone of going to an oligarchic world in which, you know, but it's a return, it's presented as if it's modern, but it's really a return to the old lords and peasants model, where the lords own everything and the peasants are like cattle to be used for labor or maybe meat, you know, and other things like that, but that they fundamentally have no power, and that the population of the peasants is to be strictly controlled. And all of this, you know, the Enron model for electricity, the spot market, futures market model for pricing of commodities and things like that, this is all a way of setting into motion a way to make money as you collapse the population of the planet. Because you're making money now not from all of these derivatives trades and things like that, which are being phased out largely. I mean, the bubble is gone. The financial markets are smaller now, and they're going to continue to get smaller as you collapse everything, as they collapse everything. And so the idea is you're going to make smaller amounts of money, but you're going to increase the level at which you gouge the population. With the idea of taking the necessities of life and pricing them high enough that there's always people who can't afford them and will get pushed off the edge while you make as much money as possible. You know, so this is the new model. This is what they're doing, and so they're shutting down everything. I mean, what Scott Walker is doing in Wisconsin is just the harbinger of the future. You pick on the labor unions in governments, because that's a good place to start. You know, you break them. The trade unions are largely broken already in the United States. You've destroyed wages in the United States by shipping most of our productive jobs overseas to places where we're competing with wherever they can find the cheapest labor in the world. That's what we're supposed to compete with, and if we want to stay competitive, we have to accept those wages. This is exactly wrong from the standpoint of physical economy, because what you want to do is have an economy in which you increase the level of pay for the average person. You want to increase their standard of living. You want to increase their level of education. You want them to become more and more capable of operating in a modern industrial economy. You want people to be able to think. You want people who are better educated, who have the capability to be creative, who can use that creativity to advance the economy. We're going in exactly the wrong direction, and we're going that way because it is precisely the wrong direction for a modern economy. This is the imperial view of the world, writ large, and that's what we have to break. We have to break this game up,
and that breaking that game has to come from here, from the United States. We have set the precedent with Glass-Steagall. The whole idea for the fixed standard of exchange. This was coming off the heels of World War II, where we defeated the British Empire intention at that point in time through Hitler to destroy the United States. We defeated that and then set up the idea being that if you have the capability to have long-term credit, you brought this up earlier with this idea of the exchange rate. If there's instability, you can't rely on the exchange rate. You can't issue credit for 30-year projects among sovereign nations, this kind of thing. These precedents, which at every turn have stymied the British Empire, have come out of the United States first. You mentioned Lincoln after the Civil War with the spread of the rail, which provided a threat to the empire. That came from the United States. After the 7 Years' War, when the British realized that when the British East India Company, when Great Britain became a Venetian empire, it was recognized at that time that territorially it was too much to control through military means. So it had to go monetary. Immediately we established tariffs, right, and shut them down on that front. At every turn historically, the problems for the British Empire have come out of the United States. And so that's what has to happen right now.
And one of the ways you mentioned tariffs, that the nation made its tax revenue was by taxing business, by taxing trade, by taxing activities, not through an income tax, not through taxing of ordinary citizens' wages, but by tariffs on commerce. Okay, that worked. But if you think about the world company idea, corporatism, in which the corporations, the big cartels, consider themselves they're not above governments, above the level of governments. This idea of what are called multinational, but I think a better word for it is imperial. That they're creatures of the empire, and as creatures of the empire, they're not subject to the laws of mere nations. That's the way we're headed. That's the way these things are viewed. And so you have increasingly the tax burden in the United States has been taken off of these corporations and put onto the ordinary people. The tax laws have been shifted to tax incomes higher than investments, or wages higher than investment income, corporate tax breaks, all sorts of things. So you have this real inequity that's growing in the tax system. You have then the Bush and Obama tax cuts, where they're giving tax breaks to the very wealthiest people, while they're demanding that we shut down everything in the real economy. Right? And the mindset behind that is imperial.
Yeah,
it's evil.
Yeah, because it's the intention behind it. Because one of the reasons that we had erected the tariffs was to foster physical economic growth in the United States then. And so whatever the particular mechanism may come to look like, whether it be through taxation, whether it be through the separation of the banks, whether it be through establishing a new global fixed exchange rate, these kinds of agreements, all of these mechanisms really flow from the intention of whether or not we're going to fulfill the preamble of the Constitution, and acting from that standpoint as a nation, then interact with other nations with the interests of the citizens, the human beings on the planet in mind first. Then that's where you get these things that you brought up with all the tax breaks and the bailout generally, and all this comes from the opposite intention of taking down the population, reducing the population morally, mentally, and physically killing people.
Yeah.
That's the point that we're at right now.
Yeah. And the way to stop that is through national sovereignty by using the Constitution, the principles upon which this nation was founded.
Yep.
Because we have the power to do it. We have to assert national sovereignty. We have to say to the empire, we're the United States, you're not. You know, you're a parasite empire, and we're going to put you out of business. You no longer operate inside the United States, for starters. You don't like it? So what?
Yeah, shutting down Wall Street wouldn't be it wouldn't be a big loss. It would be a gain.
Sure, sure.
You know?
You know, if you got a 50-pound tick sitting on top of your head, you remove it.
Yeah.
The tick would disagree. Who cares?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So you go with Glass-Steagall. An assertion of national sovereignty. This is how the banking system is going to work from here on out. No more speculating with deposits. A clear break between commercial banking and investment banking. The investment banks would squawk, but how are we going to make money if we can't steal your deposits? Well, that's the point, guys.
Yep.
Learn to live with it. All right. Then you reorganize the banking system and you look at what's real and what's not, because we're not backing any of the monopoly money. The monopoly game is going to shut down. So you have a highly regulated commercial banking system, which is not allowed to engage in speculation, period. You have the derivatives market. We end by just declaring all derivatives null and void, and henceforth no derivatives contracts can be undertaken. They're outlawed. That takes care of that. You don't have to worry about paying them off. You know, they never should have existed. They're not real. They're an affront to civilization, and they're a giant scam. It's all criminal activity, so you shut it down. You don't even blink an eye. Just shut it down. Let them scream. All right? You go to a fixed exchange rate again. Say, all right, we're going to have stability in the world. You don't get to play these games with currencies anymore. You don't get to play these games with interest rates anymore. You're out of that business. You can't make any money? Tough. You shouldn't have made it in the first place. You know, no more bricks through the window. All right.
Yeah.
So this changes the nature of the financial markets completely.
Yeah, you take away the monetary empire's ability to operate. You don't just throw people in jail or shut down this aspect or that aspect. You take away their capability to function.
Yes. All through assertion of national sovereignty.
Yeah.
That we set the rules. Nation states set the rules. The highest form of political organization on the planet is the nation state. Nation states can act together in concert in a harmony of interest to see that certain things are done. But there is no supranational power higher than the nation state. And that has to be understood. If you don't understand that, you don't understand the Constitution of the United States. You know, nothing higher than the nation state. The nation states collectively will set the rules for international trade. Those are the rules. They will be enforced. If the empire doesn't like it, that's too bad. The whole purpose of setting up this thing is to break the power of the empire and to restore sanity. You know, and this is what the LaRouche plan does so well, because it covers all of these bases. You know, you start off with Glass-Steagall, and as soon as you pass Glass-Steagall, the assertion of national sovereignty, you've changed the world.
Yeah.
You have all of these silly arguments that had Glass-Steagall had nothing to do with the crisis. You know, well, if you want to argue about this in very narrow technical ways, there are some ways in which elements of that statement are true. But the statement itself is fundamentally a lie. Mm-hmm. Because in fact, it is this continuing process of deregulation and the orgy of speculation which followed the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which created this giant bubble which is now blown up. And had we had regulation, it would not have been possible. And what FDR did was modern regulation, and that's what we have to go back to. We have to go back to the defense of the population, the defense of the nation state. We have to go back to the principles of physical economy. We have to build our way out of this. Mm-hmm. We have to do this not just by a few infrastructure projects, but by transforming our whole economy to a higher level of technology, of using the breakthroughs in universal principles that we've had, since the nuclear power was discovered. Mm-hmm. Have modern nuclear power, have magnetohydrodynamics, have NWAPA, have high-speed trains. Mm-hmm. All of this as a way of creating a new platform, as a basis for having a sound and efficient economy. That all of these things are not just in and of themselves good, but they define a new geometry of physical economy, which lifts everything up. Mm-hmm. You look at what we got as benefits out of the space program. We're still living off of that. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of idea that you go from manned flight to putting a man on the moon in just over 60 years. If you can keep up that rate of improvement, we'll be doing pretty good. But we gave that up.
I think everybody cites the $1 to $10 thing, but I think one of the more important aspects of that was the children wanting to grow up and be scientists and explore space, which I think is one of the reasons you have a lot of teachers being involved with fighting for the future right now, because that's one of the things that we start working on. NWAPA will change. Yeah, we'll get high-speed rail, maglev. We'll put engineers and scientists back to work manufacturing and these kinds of things. But I think one of the more important things is this idea of providing a future, something that's tangibly can be fought for and organized for. That you can see children who are growing up today, and you could actually look to a point in the future where you can see them being able to develop and do something useful in the world.
Yeah, that's the process we have to restart.
Yeah,
that our children grow up with the idea of pushing back the frontiers of science and making the planet a better place. Mm-hmm. That they actually have a sense of mission, and they see a way to do it, and then the fact it can be done, and that you set up an economy, a society which is based upon successive breakthroughs of universal physical principles and the implementation of those, and that it's this accelerating rate of development that makes your economy function and creates wealth. Yeah. It's not fixed assets. It's not milking every last dollar out of something before it dies. It's about this continuous transformation for the better. Yeah. And that's the way out. That's what created the United States. When we functioned, that's how we functioned. Mm-hmm. We've abandoned that and we don't function anymore. And we better get back to it or we're going to collapse, as we see.
Yeah. As is happening right now.
Yeah. But that's the goal, to change the whole relationship of the people to science and progress. Mm-hmm. We don't have to sit back and watch everything die. Yeah. And as you can see with the number of people who are out in the streets, there are a lot of people who may not have quite the understanding of what needs to be done, but they're not prepared to just roll over and play dead while they're being destroyed.
Yeah.
And they're right. They shouldn't. But you gotta have the idea of where you need to go in mind, so that when the provocateurs come in and say, "Let's go kill somebody," you tell them, "Shut up." We're building civilization here. We're not destroying it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's a good place to end the discussion today. Stay tuned to this website, and that's all for now.